The courtroom was already buzzing when I walked in. Reporters shifted in their seats' lenses trained on the empty bench. Spectators murmured behind the bar, whispering predictions like gamblers placing bets. Everyone knew today's trial was national news. But what they didn't know, what no one was prepared for, was me. I wore no jewelry, no makeup, just the black robes of my office and a face carved from restraint. The bailiff opened the door. "All rise," he announced. His voice barely carried over the rustle of movement, but it didn't have to, because the next voice sliced through the air like a cold wind. "Presiding today, Chief Justice Cassandra Ellis." The clerk said it flatly, like it was any other day, like the name hadn't been missing from my family's mouths for 10 years. Jason's head snapped up. His posture collapsed, the smug tension in his jaw, dissolving into something he rarely showed confusion. For a man who had live-streamed his life, he looked suddenly unscripted. "Elena," he whispered. "My name, my real name, spoken like a ghost he thought he'd buried." I didn't flinch, didn't blink, just took my place at the bench, high above the courtroom, higher than they'd ever imagined I'd rise. My mother's voice was a trembling breath. "Elena, save your brother. He's still your blood." Her voice cracked in English, but her eyes spoke the language of desperation only I could understand. I kept my hand steady on the wood. "Please, Ma'am," I said calmly, each syllable deliberate, clipped and clear. "Address me correctly. I'm Judge Cassie." A ripple ran through the gallery, like wind through dry leaves. One reporter dropped their pen. Another leaned toward their cameraman and mouthed, "That's her." CNN was already whispering online, was Cassandra Ellis really? Elena Carter, the estranged daughter of the Carter family dynasty. The question would answer itself. I didn't need to confirm it. All I needed to do was sit, breathe, rule. Because of the conflict of interest, I wasn't supposed to preside. But no judge would take this case too public, too volatile, too wrapped in political heat. They appointed me, temporarily assuming I'd recuse myself, that I'd be professional, that I'd step aside like a good little girl. I didn't. Not out of vengeance, not out of pride, but because the law doesn't need comfort, it needs clarity. And if the only way to ensure this trial wouldn't be derailed by influence was to put me in this chair, then so be it. I would sit when no one saved me a seat, and I would do the job no one thought I'd survive. The prosecutor cleared her throat. The defense attorney stood paralyzed. Jason looked at me like I was someone else, because to him, I was. I wasn't the little sister he called a buzzkill at every birthday party. I wasn't the law student he mocked on Facebook for reading books while everyone else made money. I wasn't the girl they told to lower her voice and wear softer colours. I was the court. And in this room, I had no past, only power. Behind me, a senior judge sat in the observation row. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck, weighing every move. A test. They wanted to see if I could separate memory from mandate, if I would tremble or cry or crack. But I had built my spine from years of silence. I didn't need their belief. I had my own. Jason turned to his lawyer, whispering frantically. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the script. He was likely asking if I could legally do this, if a judge could preside over her own brother's trial. The answer was no. Not usually. Not unless no one else stepped up. Not unless public trust had already frayed, and the law needed a face that wouldn't flinch. He glanced back at me. His eyes were pleading now. Not furious, not arrogant, just pleading. As if he could summon a sibling bond we never had, and twist it into mercy. I offered him nothing. Not because I didn't feel, but because feeling had no place here. The charges were printed in bold on the docket before me: criminal fraud, endangerment, conspiracy, false advertising. Each word heavier than the last. His products marketed as nutritional chewables for children had caused harm across the country. No FDA approval, no clinical testing, just branding, sugar, and lies. A mother had taken her sick child to the ER and refused to stay quiet. She'd sent the candy to a lab, posted the report, filed a complaint. The dominoes fell faster than anyone expected, and now we were here. Outside, I could hear the low hum of helicopters. News vans circled like vultures. Inside, it was quiet, almost reverent. Even Jason's defense team had stilled, sensing the shift in gravity. "Court is now in session," I said, voice firm. "You may be seated." The room obeyed. I looked at Jason again, not as his sister, but as the woman he never saw coming. And I thought, not bitterly, not even sadly, just factually, they said I failed. And then I walked in. Because failure to them looked a lot like not fitting their mold. From the very beginning, I was too much of everything. They didn't know how to love. Too quiet, too sharp, too drawn to books instead of the kitchen. They used to say I had a brain that worked like a boy's, as if it were an infection. I remember the first time I fell in love with the Constitution. I was 9. Miss Drayton, my civics teacher, held it like scripture. She handed me a printed copy thin as a church bulletin. "This," she said, "is where power lives." I read it in one night, highlighted it with a borrowed yellow crayon, memorized parts by sunrise. When I recited the preamble at breakfast, my father lowered his paper, barely glancing over the rim of his glasses. "Sweetheart," he muttered, "you're not running for office. Learn to cook rice instead." Jason laughed so hard he spit milk out his nose. "She thinks she's Ruth Bader Ginsburg." "No," my mother said, not unkindly, just flat. Ruth was married. That was always the bar marriage, not justice, not conviction. I could have argued a Supreme Court case in the living room, and they still would have asked who was picking me up afterward. Jason, meanwhile, could shoot a 10-second video of feeding chickens and be hailed as our little visionary. They framed one of his TikTok screenshots and placed it above the mantel. My debate trophy. It sat in a box beneath the stairs until it rusted. There was one year I think I was 12. I made it to state finals in public speaking. I'd written a piece on the First Amendment. My coach said it made her cry. I begged my mother to come. She said she couldn't. Jason had a goat show at the county fair, and family supports what feeds the family. I stood on that stage alone. I saw the empty seat we'd saved for her in the front row, and I spoke anyway. Loud, clear, clean. Afterward, a judge leaned in and whispered, "You speak like a woman who already knows what she's worth." I smiled politely, but I didn't believe her. Not yet. Our house had one bookshelf. It was in Jason's room, filled with books our parents never read, but loved to display biographies of entrepreneurs' guides to branding, how to win friends. My books, case law, historical treatises, legal philosophy, had no place there. So I studied on the kitchen floor, cross-legged, elbow pressed to cold tile, flipping pages by the light of the oven clock. My mother hated when I did that, said it made the house feel less warm. I suppose she meant less like hers. She once told me after I corrected Jason on the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony. No man wants to be explained to by a woman. You think you're clever, but clever doesn't cuddle. Be softer. So I tried. For one full week, I spoke less, smiled more. I even wore the pink cardigan she bought for me, the one with the pearls. Jason said I looked like a kindergarten teacher. My father said nothing at all. That week, I earned the highest mock trial score in school history. I didn't tell anyone. Achievements didn't land well in our home unless they came with a paycheck or a wedding ring. Jason was charming, always had been. He could sell ice to an Eskimo, as my dad proudly declared. By 16, he was building a following online, wholesome clips of fixing tractors, talking about grit, calling my mother the strongest woman alive as he handed her surprise gifts on camera. She'd tear up every time. "He knows how to show love," she'd whisper. I'd be in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes alone, wondering how I'd missed that lesson. What they didn't see, what they refused to see, was that I loved too. Just differently. I loved through logic, through structure, through staying up to help Jason file his first LLC paperwork, even though he never thanked me. I loved by learning the laws that might one day protect us both. But none of that made it into the family scrapbook. Once after Jason won a local grant for his rural content, my father toasted him at dinner. To our boy, he said, raising his glass. Proof that you don't need college to be a success. Then he turned to me, and to Elena, who always tries her best. It should have stung. It didn't. By then, I'd learned to catalogue those comments, like case law emotionally charged, but ultimately irrelevant. What mattered was the path. Mine was longer, lonelier, less glittered with likes, but it was mine. And even if no one clapped when I crossed a milestone, I would keep walking. Years later, when I saw Jason's face across billboards for Too Bright smiling next to a cartoon of a toddler chewing with sparkles, I knew exactly how the world would praise him again. Sweet, simple, savable. While I, somewhere deep in the archives of legal academia, was being told by professors I might intimidate juries if I didn't smile more during arguments. So I trained myself to smile less. Speak firmer, not to win affection, but to hold ground. They thought I failed because I wasn't visible in the way Jason was. But I was never invisible. Just unread by those who refused to learn my language. And now they had no choice but to listen. But there was a time when even I wasn't sure anyone ever would. Georgetown Law magna cum laude. 3 years of late nights pro bono cases, 2 part-time jobs and 1 lost scholarship appeal that nearly broke me. But I made it. I didn't just survive law school, I owned it. I was chosen to give the valedictory address. The dean shook my hand and whispered, "You remind me of the ones who rewrite things, not just follow them." The auditorium stood when I walked off stage. Hundreds of strangers clapped for the girl no one at home believed in. I stood alone in my cap and gown outside Healy Hall, holding my diploma against my chest, the gold tassel catching in the wind. Around me, classmates posed with beaming families, champagne bottles popping in bursts. Parents kissed foreheads, siblings held "We're proud of you" signs. My arms stayed empty. No one came. Not my mother, not my father, not even a text that morning. For a moment, I scanned the crowd just in case. Maybe they'd surprise me. Maybe they were late. But I knew better. They weren't coming. Because that day, my day Jason had gone viral again. Somewhere back in Pennsylvania, he was live streaming from a dealership. He blindfolded my mother and walked her to a white Escalade wrapped in a red bow. "To the best mum in the world," he said. She sobbed into his chest. The clip hit 1 million views before I even got my diploma cover. My phone buzzed nonstop in my pocket. I didn't look until later. It wasn't congratulations. It was my mother sending me a pin drop. "Dinner tomorrow," she texted. "You're meeting someone nice. He's in finance." I had just graduated top of my class and she was setting up a blind date. I should have been angry. Instead, I just stood there, still in my gown, still in my heels, still invisible to the only people whose validation I'd once craved. It was then that someone tapped me gently on the shoulder. A girl from my civil procedure class, Raya, I think. She smiled a little hesitant and handed me a small card. "You probably don't remember me," she said, "but you once helped me pass contracts." I would have dropped out without that. "And your speech today, it was everything. I just wanted you to know you have value, even when the people closest to you don't see it." I didn't cry until she walked away. I held that card in both hands like it was proof I existed. I still keep it in my wallet. Creased ink, faded but real. That night, I watched the replay of Jason's live stream alone. The comments were full of hearts and goals and what a son, but all I saw was a performance. One I used to envy. One I now understood was hollow. He looked like the perfect son because he played a role people recognised. I never fit the script. After graduation, I flew back home for a week. I shouldn't have. But I thought maybe now, with a diploma in my hand and a future on the rise, they'd see me. Really see me. Instead, my mother greeted me at the door with, "Pack something nice. You're meeting Timothy on Wednesday. And Samuel on Friday. They're both from good families." I laughed. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. I left my suitcase at the foot of the stairs and walked into the kitchen, still in my blazer from the flight. Jason was filming something by the stove, his camera set on a tripod. "You're back," he said casually. "Congrats," or whatever. Then he turned to our dad. "Can you believe this TikTok sponsor just paid me 20 grand to mention their tea?" My father smiled, pride beaming. That's how real success looks. I stood there in the kitchen where I used to read law cases on the floor and realised I had never truly left invisibility. I had just carried it with me, until I wouldn't anymore. I slept one night in my childhood room. The next morning I left before sunrise. No note, no goodbye. Just the weight of 1,000 things never said, and the whisper of Raya's card still echoing in my bag. And then came the parade of men. 3 of them in 7 days. Polished, confident, and curated like museum pieces. One wore a gold watch that caught the light every time he checked it during our date. One told me he only respected women who knew their place but had a sense of humour. The third, he said nothing inappropriate, but nothing real either. Just polite nods and questions about how I'd balance my little career with motherhood. Each dinner was like walking into a theatre where I'd already been cast. My mother chose my outfits pastels always. Soft colours make you look less intense, she'd murmur, ironing the sleeves with maternal precision. Before each outing, she'd apply a dab of perfume behind my ears, whispering, "Don't speak too much. Men don't marry lectures." I smiled. I sat. I answered. But inside, I was shrinking. Not because I felt unworthy, no, that wasn't it. I felt misplaced, misinterpreted, like a foreign book in a household that only read bestsellers. Jason's face was on a billboard that week, a local ad for a rural lifestyle brand. My father passed it every day on the way to work and told me, twice, "Your brother knows how to build something people care about." What he didn't say was louder, "And you don't." That week I didn't sleep, not because of heartbreak, but because of the weight of their expectations pressing down like wet wool, heavy, clinging, suffocating. It all came to a head on a Thursday night. The rain had started early summer thunder, loud like applause meant for someone else. My mother cornered me in the kitchen. She held her phone like a weapon of duty. "He's a civil engineer, he just bought a house. You'd be safe." Safe. As if marriage was a storm cellar, as if life only had value when protected by a man's title, a man's mortgage. I asked her calmly, "Did you ever wonder what I want?" She blinked, as if that had never occurred to her. "Elena, we want what's best for you." "No," I said. "You want what's familiar." She narrowed her eyes. "Don't be dramatic. You're not that special." That stung, not because it was new, but because I realised it was their version of love. Keep her humble, keep her contained. I left the kitchen. My father was watching Jason's live stream. My brother was selling a new line of organic farm soap. 100,000 viewers. "He's a genius," Dad muttered, eyes glowing. "You should ask if he needs legal help. At least that way your degree would mean something." That was the moment. The click in my chest, the lock turning. I walked upstairs, heart steady. I didn't pack much. A few clothes, my notebook, my acceptance letter to Georgetown, the old folder with my mock trial awards, and Raya's card folded once down the middle, the ink slightly smudged from when I read it under the sink. Light, the night I cried silently while everyone else laughed at Jason's latest video. I left a note, not long, not angry. Just truth, I'm not leaving because I'm lost. I'm leaving to find who I am. I placed it gently on my desk. The same desk Jason had once borrowed for a product shoot and never returned. For weeks, my books were stacked on the floor. My mother had said, "Let him use it. He needs it more." The house was dark, save for the flickering of the porch light. I walked past Jason's room full of ring lights, boxes of branded mugs, fan letters on the wall. I walked past the family portrait in the hallway, where I was asked to stand slightly behind because the lighting favoured Jason's side, and then I stepped outside. The rain hit my skin like freedom. Cold, uninvited, real. No one saw me leave. No one called out. The world did not pause, and yet everything changed. There's something holy about walking away quietly. No slammed doors, no final scream, just breath, just steps, it's just decision. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time I wasn't trying to arrive somewhere. I was trying to begin. And beginning often looks like walking barefoot through puddles with nothing but a duffel bag and a name you're about to shed. Cassandra Ellis. I whispered it to myself each morning as I roughed the subway platform, and each night while the city's streetlights blinked in rhythm with my racing thoughts. I wasn't the name I'd been born with anymore, but neither was I the failure they claimed I was. I found a tiny studio apartment in Queens, one floor. A slanted ceiling and faucet stained a waterlogged hue. A pair of scrawny roaches claimed half the kitchen shelf, but every inch of that space was mine. It felt like a declaration I belonged here. I had scraped together the first month's rent by shelving law books at a legal aid clinic and filing paperwork at a courthouse internship I wasn't technically qualified for. But I arrived before dawn and left long after dusk. My application said Cassandra Ellis, but no one suspected I'd once been Elena Carter, the same girl who was told she'd never amount to anything more than a bookish daughter with no business in court. Meanwhile, my brother, my older brother, the Golden Son, became MTV's Midwestern poster boy. Under the alias J Country, he posted videos of himself waking chickens before dawn, hauling hay bales in flannel, and weaving sentimental family stories. He talked about real work and grounded living, and people ate it up like gospel. Soon, affiliate pictures followed charcoal toothpaste, beard oil, single origin granola. Then came Muskroot by Jay, his own deodorant line, which sold out within days. Screenshots started tagging me. "Is this your brother? Bro turned celeb overnight. Check out your mum's comment." I tried not to watch. I was dunking a stale instant noodle in broth, trying not to cry, when my phone buzzed again. The video looped Jason handing a gift to our mum, her eyes filling. "You didn't have to do this," she sniffled. He smiled and said, "Of course I did. You gave me everything." She replied with tears, "My son, my pride." A pause. Then she typed under the video, "My son, the best person I know, my heart, my joy." The bowl in my lap went cold. Behind me, the leaky faucet tapped its applause. I had nowhere else to go. One afternoon, in the courthouse break room, sterile lights, a dusty vending machine, the smell of reheated coffee. A friendly colleague sat opposite me. Mariah, mid-20s empathetic, recently graduated from law school. She looked at me carefully like she was trying to solve my silence. "Cassandra," she asked, "do you ever call home?" I stared at the break room tiles and folded my sandwich wrapper like origami. I blinked slow. I don't think they'd recognize my voice. Not because I changed it, but because they never learned it. Mariah didn't press. She just nodded, and I felt less alone than I had in years. A small bridge, exactly what I needed. Life outside my work felt like a second plane. Jason exploded across TikTok and YouTube with Chew Bright, a chewable vial of flavour, branded for children, marketed with hushed sincerity. For strong bodies, brighter minds, I kept seeing ads on buses, geo-targeted pop-ups, playground sponsorship trailers. A few bites were all it took to feel good, he claimed. But experience told me half-truths never stay buried. By then, I'd passed the bar exam, barely enough money left to buy a modest gift, a strand of pearl earrings at a street vendor's stand. I bought them not out of vanity, but as punctuation and exclamation on a sentence that had dragged so long it nearly finished me. No one knew I'd cried in that apartment. No one knew I'd pinned my hopes on silence and small resolute steps forward. When your past is littered with erasure, anonymity becomes sanctuary. I didn't disappear. I refocused. Meanwhile, behind the filter of rural charm and family values, Jason's empire was booming. He staged gift-giving to Mom for content, masterful, well-lighted, and she smiled for the camera. Pop-up pop-in pumps played in the background. Comments overflowed. This is why I love wholesome families. That boy's got a heart of gold. One evening at work, Mariah peeked over my cubicle. "Cassie, do you regret changing your name?" she asked, voice low. I paused. "No," I said finally, "because Elena Carter would always be the daughter they never saw, and Cassandra Ellis is the woman I chose to become." She smiled. That was enough. After work that night, I strolled past a city bus with my face name obscured promoting Chew Bright. I paused and touched the side numb. A single tear crawled down my cheek. So I walked on silent, determined. Because sometimes rebuilding yourself in a building block world means starting in dark rooms where nobody's applauding. And sometimes, just sometimes, the applause shifts louder in courtrooms than in family kitchens. The first ripple came quietly. A mother mid-30s, exhausted, thin-eyed from sleepless nights, filed a complaint to the Consumer Safety Bureau. Her 5-year-old had been vomiting, uncontrollably dehydrated, listless. The ER doctor told her it was likely a reaction to something ingested. When she mentioned Chew Bright, the nurse raised an eyebrow. "We've seen this brand before. You might want to have it tested." The chewables looked innocent enough. Bright colours, fruit flavours, cartoon bears smiling on the label, marketed for enhanced appetite and brain support. A quote from J Country printed along the side. "What I give my nephews, I'd give your kids too." But the lab didn't see vitamins. They saw sucrose artificial dye flavouring and polyethylene glycol. Laxative, no protein, no fibre, no minerals, just sugar chemicals, and a dangerously inflated promise. The mother went to a local reporter. "My son was sick for days," she said. And I realised I bought that candy, not because it looked safe, but because he, Jason, said it on TikTok. That's when the dominoes began to fall. More parents came forward. Then paediatricians, then schools. Videos surfaced of Jason claiming, "Chew Bright is FDA cleared." He wore white coats in some ads, sometimes had fake medical charts in the background. But the FDA found no record, no clinical trial, no lab affiliation, no approval. There wasn't even a warehouse, just a rented studio in upstate New York repainted to resemble a factory floor. I heard the case come through legal channels before the public did. As a federal observer in regulatory fraud, I was assigned to review files from the Internal Ethics Board. A grey folder landed on my desk. Product Investigation, Dietary Consumables Case, ID 0873. I flipped through the file, photos of the packaging, screenshots of J Country's videos. The smile I hadn't seen in years. My pulse didn't spike, my hands didn't tremble. It was just another mask, just another boy who'd made his career pretending he had no sister. But beneath the marketing, the documents reeked of fabrication. Signatures didn't match. Third-party lab names were dead ends. I flagged 10 inconsistencies before the second cup of coffee. By day 3, a formal investigation was opened. That's when I received an email. Chief Observer Ellis, your background in commercial fraud makes you a candidate to supervise the preliminary compliance hearing. I reread the name, Ellis, Cassandra Ellis, the name I chose. Not the one that betrayed me. I accepted. No hesitation. I entered the conference room for the internal review, and the defense counsel was already seated. Then the door opened, and Jason walked in. He didn't recognize me. Not at first. He nodded to the counsel, adjusted his cuffs. His hair shorter than I remembered. The cowboy veneer still clung to him even in a grey blazer. Then he looked up, and for a flicker, his smile faltered. Just a beat. His eyes squinted, tilted his head. I watched his lips press together and his posture stiffen, but he said nothing. Neither did I, because in that moment we both knew. And still, only one of us understood what came next. The internal review revealed worse than negligence. There were emails leaked from Jason's COO referencing bribes to certification officers. There were phone logs to shell companies. The scientific advisor on the TubeRight website turned out to be an actor who also starred in local insurance ads. The smile was the same, just new lines. As proceedings escalated, I recused myself from active prosecution. Legally, I had to. Morally, I didn't mind. Because from that day on, the storm wasn't mine to summon, it was his to survive. Within weeks, J Country was suspended across platforms. Investors pulled out. Lawsuits piled in. Mothers wept on new segments. He knew we trusted him. He knew. Class action was filed across 4 states. Then, the state of New York issued formal charges, consumer fraud, false advertising, endangerment of minors, conspiracy. But none of the headlines said Jason Carter. They all said J Country. And I remember thinking, funny how a mask can become your real name, while your truth becomes a ghost. For months I followed the case from a distance. I poured my energy into real victims, real fraud, real damage repair. But the echoes followed me. His face was everywhere now, with caution warnings. Comment sections flooded with betrayal. I gave that candy to my daughter. Shame on you. You're no country boy. You're just a liar with a ring light. Still, not once did he apologize publicly. He issued a press release full of conditional phrasing, if any harm was unintentionally caused. We're reviewing our processes. TubeRight was created with love. Love doesn't lie about science. Love doesn't use a child's trust as currency. Love doesn't build empires from hollow promises. It was never love. It was leverage. And when I closed that final report, my initials in blue ink at the bottom of the compliance review, I wrote something no one else would ever read. Just a single note on a sticky tab beside his name. Sometimes the poison isn't in the product. It's in the person who promises it will save you. That line sat on my desk like a whispered prophecy when the phone rang. They need you in DC, my clerk said. It's about the Carter case. I stared at the file on my desk. I hadn't opened it, not fully. Not until now. The seal bore the United States District Court. The name stamped in the upper corner was familiar in the way that a childhood scar is Jason Carter, my brother. I wasn't supposed to take the case. Everyone said so. The ethics board, the press, the law school interns on Reddit. Conflict of interest. Emotional proximity. Too close. Too raw. But no one else would touch it. The public backlash, the scale of the fraud, the fact that his face had once smiled on cereal boxes and parenting forums, it was a career trap disguised as justice. The Chief Justice had called it radioactive, but I wasn't afraid of radiation. I had been raised in it, invisible, muted, slowly forged. So I accepted the temporary appointment. The order came down. I would not recuse. I would preside. There was no announcement, no leak, just a morning docket that read US v. Jason Carter, Justice Cassandra Ellis presiding. I arrived early. The corridors were already lined with journalists whispering into their earpieces, hoping for a twist. They had no idea the twist was already seated, robe folded across her arm heels, clicking toward the chamber that had never been designed for her, but now bore her name. Inside the courtroom, the bailiff adjusted the microphones. The flag stood stiffly behind the bench. I stood behind the doors as the room filled. Jason entered, first flanked by attorneys and PR advisors. My parents followed Mother's eyes, darting Father's hand on her back like a prop. My aunt whispered, "Chi sao chua thay tham fan." My mother adjusted her brooch. "Ko le jang toi." And then I walked in. All rise. My shoes echoed across the marble floor. I didn't smile. I didn't blink. I didn't even breathe like the girl they remembered. I took my seat with a stillness that made noise. My robe fell over the chair like thunder. The clerk stood. This court is now in session. The Honourable Cassandra Ellis presiding. Jason looked up. Our eyes met, and in one instant the past and present collided so violently I thought the room might fracture. "Elena," he said, a whisper, not meant to travel, but it did. My mother inhaled sharply. My father dropped his gaze to the floor. I did not respond. "This is a federal criminal proceeding," I said. "All parties will address the court through counsel. Any personal appeals are inappropriate and will be disregarded." Jason flinched not from the words, but from the voice. He knew that tone. He'd heard it once when I was 16, arguing with a teacher about the Bill of Rights. He'd mocked me later, called me Miss Justice. I had smiled then. I did not smile now. My mother turned to my aunt. "Jo la combe Jo," as she whispered suddenly, aware that the CNN cameras had caught her. My aunt stared ahead. "That's your daughter." Jason's lawyer leaned in. "Is that your sister?" he asked. Jason nodded slowly. "She used to be." A beat of silence. I looked at the defense table. "Mr. Carter, do you wish to enter a plea?" Jason swallowed. "Not guilty," he said, but it sounded like a question. Outside headlines were already being written. Federal judge presiding over brother's trial, a twist of fate or conflict of ethics. On Twitter, the debate exploded. Judge Cassie trended within the hour. But inside that courtroom there was no debate. Only law. Only silence. I saw my mother shift in her seat. I saw her lips part to speak. "Elena Lamont," I raised one hand. Not dramatically. Just firmly. "Please, Mom," I said. "Address me correctly. I'm Judge Cassie." Her mouth trembled closed. Jason stared at me like a man realizing the ceiling is a mirror. "You're really doing this," he whispered. I said nothing. Because the truth didn't need defense. I wasn't there to punish. I wasn't there to get even. I was there to ensure the scales didn't tip, not in his favor, not in mine, just in the direction of truth. And still, I heard my younger self in the back of that courtroom. The girl who once sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor, reading constitutional law by lamplight, while Jason played video games above her. She was quiet now, but not erased. She had simply moved, higher, firmer, into a seat no one ever saved for her. I brought the gavel down once. The sound echoed. The case had begun, and they finally realized I hadn't just returned. I had arrived. In that moment, every eye in the courtroom locked onto me, not as the sister, not even as the force behind the law, but as the living embodiment of principle. I cleared my throat, then spoke. My voice was steady, measured, controlled like the slow release of a tide. "Counsel for the prosecution, your opening statement." I sank into the chair behind the bench, hands folded. Every seam of my robe and every syllable I would speak was deliberate. Silence fell. The prosecuting attorney began laying out the accusations, deceptive marketing endangering children, forging certifications and fabricating facilities. Each phrase hung in the air like a verdict long before evidence was presented. I listened unwavering, as if my stillness alone upheld the rule of law. Then came the defense. Jason's lead counsel adjusted his tie, swallowed hard, and pressed forward with a plea for misunderstanding, for nuance, for compassion. But when Jason himself attempted to address me just once, I held the courtroom's silence like a shield. "Elena," he whispered, voice shaking, and I responded firmly. "Mr. Carter, please proceed via your attorney." Not a rebuke, not cold, just correct, impersonal. The hush was absolute. It reflected off the walls, the bench, the gallery. It was not hostility, it was authority. A law student watching from her dorm live-streamed the moment. Her video captured the eyes of my mother trembling on the bench, the shake of my father's hand on his cane, the rare certainty in my aunt's stiff posture. In the caption, she wrote, "That woman just became my hero." A chuckle from someone in the audience snapped me back, but I kept my face calm, my posture unyielding. Show trials rely on spectacle. This was substance. My silence roared louder than any flashy rebuttal. Witnesses were called. Experts describing test results, sugar content, laxatives, health hazards. I listened, absorbing nuance, the language of science, of policy, of law. There was no room for family drama here. Just facts, just legal reasoning. When Jason's PR advisor stood to object, claiming emotional damage, undue public influence, I maintained decorum. "Sustained," I said. "The court will seal the next exchange." That sentence was weighty. It signified restraint, impartiality, adherence to protocol. I was no longer Elena Carter, the sister. I was Cassandra Ellis, the gatekeeper of justice. At one point, a young mother testified quietly about her son's hospitalization, a vivid emotional moment that had the courtroom leaning in. I refrained from interjecting. I let the words speak for themselves. Another glimmer of humanity, another injury carried by invisible witnesses. This was not just product failure, it was betrayal. In the back row, I caught my mother's hands knitting a napkin. She once said, "I'd have no one to care for me. Look at her now, her knuckles white." The daughter she thought would be alone had become the centre of attention in a national trial. I paused the proceedings for a brief recess. As the bailiff called a break, I watched Jason slump in his seat, his shoulders rounded. I watched the defence counsel glance at me, searching for doubt that wasn't there. I observed the press scribbling furiously. The law student outside wouldn't stop her live stream either. Her caption changed to, "This is what power looks like." Silent, precise, relentless. When court reconvened, it was time for examination. Piecing together all the evidence into a coherent sequence. Experts affirmed lab results. Documents were validated. Each statement, each question, tightened the web until there was nowhere for the defence to pivot. I didn't intervene. I simply let the process unfold, abiding by procedure. My silence underscored the gravity of their words. Every ruling was deliberate, and every restraint spoke of fairness. Jason's lawyer had one final manoeuvre, an emotional appeal. He described Jason's ancient values, his charitable donations. He pointed to the video where Jason helped build a barn for a disabled vet. He asked, "Is a mistake worth destroying a life's work?" I rested my gaze squarely on the jury. Each face held that question. Views shifted as they weighed side by side warm livestream emotions versus clinical lab truths, cherry-picked kindness versus undeniable harm. My role was to facilitate, not to sway. When deliberation began, I recessed with a single instruction: jury will resume at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Court is adjourned. No gavel. Just clarity. Just law. I walked off the bench robe, heavy but purposeful. The courtroom remained frozen, a testament to what happens when authority isn't performative, but rooted in truth. Journalists lingered at the front. Smartphones lingered at the doors. But I walked past them all without flinching, because true verdicts aren't declared. They are earned. And I had not given up, just as I had never given up on myself. But that version of me, the one who scrubbed court hallways after hours clutching flashcards in her jacket pocket, she lived a dozen lives before this gavel ever touched my palm. Before they called me Judge Cassie, I was Elena, filing copies for an attorney who never learned my name. I was the intern who got coffee orders right, but citations even better. I was the public defender who lost 3 cases in a row and cried in a bathroom stall, then wiped her face with a paper towel and walked back into court like her heart hadn't just cracked in private. They say your past doesn't define you. But that's only half true. It shadows you quietly, persistently, until you choose whether to shape it or let it shape you. When I took the oath as Chief Justice, my hands didn't shake, but they remembered everything. The weight of student loan letters, the nights I spent tutoring undergrad kids on constitutional theory just so I could afford bus fare, the floor of the janitor's closet where I once changed out of my cleaning uniform and into a blazer before morning court. No one handed me anything. I didn't inherit a last name that opened doors. I didn't get a mentor who cleared a path. I had a boss who once said, "You're not like anyone I've trained before. You burn different." I smiled politely then, but I didn't believe him. Not until I started lighting my own trail. Becoming Cassandra Ellis wasn't just a name change. It was an act of reclamation, a declaration. I knew Elena Carter couldn't survive in a world where Jason's shadow was gospel. I needed distance not from my roots, but from their script. Cassandra wasn't born. She was constructed, brick by brick, from every overlooked interview, every ignored resume, every time someone called me Miss instead of Mom, even when I held the law in my hands. There was a month I couldn't afford my final semester unless I won a community legal writing competition. I entered with a 12-page brief drafted at a 24-hour diner and printed at the public library just before the deadline. I won. The prize money paid my tuition and my rent for a month. That paper. It's still folded inside a notebook on my office shelf, not because I'm sentimental, but because I don't believe in erasing the fight it took to stand here. I moved cities twice, each time starting over, each time quieter, more precise. I listened more than I spoke. I observed how power moved who used it, who feared it, and who wore it like a borrowed coat. I made myself fluent in rooms I once felt invisible in, and all the while no one knew. No one connected Cassandra Ellis, federal prosecutor, to the girl who once scraped dried paint off her childhood wall because her parents refused to let her repaint it blue. They didn't know I'd slept on a futon for 2 years so I could afford law books. They didn't know the woman who sat across from them in arbitration had once washed the same floors they now strutted across in designer heels. They only knew what they saw a name on a resume, a voice in a courtroom, a verdict that landed like a blade. But my story, it wasn't in the verdicts. It was in the getting there. I remember one winter morning before dawn when I caught my reflection in the courthouse window, eyes tired blazer 2 sizes too big, hair still wet from the hurried shower. I didn't look powerful, I looked like effort incarnate. But that morning, I decided something quiet and irreversible. I would never again wait for applause. I would clap for myself. Now, when people introduce me as the youngest woman to ever hold my position, they smile and wait for me to beam back. I don't, not because I'm not proud, but because their pride comes at the end of the story. Mine came every time I turned the page. Once someone asked if I ever regretted leaving my family. I didn't answer. I just thought of the silence that filled the gaps between our conversations, the way they could talk about my brother for hours and mention me as an afterthought. Regret, no. I regret nothing that brought me here. Sometimes I wonder what Elena would say if she met Cassandra now. I think she'd smile just slightly and whisper, "Took you long enough," but I'd know she meant it with love, because this wasn't a miracle. It was muscle, the kind you build in silence in darkness, when no one claps and no one's watching. And it's the kind that carries you not to a destination, but into your own definition of arrival. And here I was, not to prove them wrong, but to prove me right. I stood outside the house I once called home keys, I never used, again clenched in my palm. The door was still that faded pine green, chipped around the knob from years of Jason slamming it shut behind him. Nothing had changed, except everything had. I hadn't been back in almost a decade. And when I stepped into the hallway, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that hums with stories no one asked to hear again. Upstairs, my old room had no name anymore. The plaque that used to read Elena in glitter sticker letters was gone. The door was open, but the room behind it felt foreign, like stepping into someone else's closet. The walls were lined with cardboard boxes. Some labelled Holiday Promo, others Shoe Bright Batch 47. My desk, no longer a desk, was a table for folding t-shirts, with Jason's face printed across the chest. His posters covered the corners like ivy swallowing brick, and my old bookshelf dismantled. The books long gone, probably donated or dumped. In their place were ring lights and unopened brand deals. On the floor, right where I used to sit, cross-legged reading Thurgood Marshall's rulings, was a stack of empty marketing envelopes. I could still smell the glue. No one said anything when I came downstairs. My mother didn't ask how the law was treating me. She asked if I wanted tea. The same tea she made for Jason every morning. I declined. Later that night, in a hotel room 4 miles from the courthouse, I opened the drawer of the nightstand and found a Gideon Bible. I hadn't opened one in years, but this time I flipped straight to Exodus, because that's what it was. An exodus, a leaving, a reclaiming. That week I received a letter official and sealed. The Judicial Council had approved my elevation to Chief Justice Pro Tem pending the investigation into Jason Carter. No one else had agreed to oversee the trial. Every judge passed. Too volatile, too public, too risky. But I didn't flinch, because when your story has already been scorched, you stop fearing the fire. You learn to walk through it. They thought I'd recuse myself. Conflict of interest. Family name, all valid, all expected. But no one asked me what I thought. So I stayed. And as I walked through the marble halls of the Supreme Court in Washington, past portraits of men who never had to fight to be taken seriously, I saw it, the empty space on the far wall, freshly painted, newly lit. That's where they hung my portrait. Chief Justice Cassandra Ellis? I stood in front of it for 10 minutes, maybe longer, not admiring, just remembering. My collar was starched, my eyes direct, not smiling, but not hard either, just unwavering. A staff member walked past and nodded politely. "New edition?" he asked. I nodded. She looks like she's seen some things he said, and done them anyway. I smiled faintly. She has. That portrait wasn't proof of victory. It was evidence of resistance. Each stroke in the oil was a case fought in silence. A moment survived, without applause, a decision made in darkness, with no one watching but me. One afternoon, a young associate clerk stopped me in the hall. She looked barely 23. "Ma'am," she said, eyes wide, "can I ask, do you have a family?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the answer needed no words. "I used to," I said, but they never saw me. She nodded slowly, as if she understood too well. And maybe she did. At night, when the halls were empty and the court's echo softened into breath, I sometimes stood in front of that portrait again, not to gloat, not even to reflect, But to remind myself, they took a room, and I built a chamber. They silenced my voice, and I turned that silence into law. Legacy isn't about who remembers your name when you leave. It's about what you leave behind when they remember you too late. And that chamber, it wasn't built with permission. It was built with persistence. It was built with persistence. The letter came folded in half with no return address. The paper was cheap thin, the kind used in facilities where time moves slowly and envelopes are inspected. Her name was written on the front, not the name her parents had given her, but the name she'd chosen, Cassandra Ellis. The handwriting was unmistakably Jason's. Still, all capital letters still slanting left, like he was in a hurry to prove he knew what direction looked like. Inside, a single photo. A girl maybe 10 in oversized glasses, and a too big blazer holding a trophy with both hands like it might break. She was smiling, wide, awkward, hopeful. Behind her empty chairs. No family, no hands clapping, no father in a tie, no mother in pearls. Just her. Just silence. Elena remembered that moment, not for the win, but for the echo that followed. The echo of nothing. She turned the photo over. On the back, scrawled in blue pen, I see you now. And I'm sorry. She didn't cry, didn't rage, just stared at it for a long time, then folded it gently and placed it inside her desk drawer behind a stack of amicus briefs. Because some apologies aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to arrive late like postcards from cities you've already outgrown. That weekend, she went back to where it all began. The college had invited her to give a keynote for women in law. She almost declined. Not because she didn't want to go, but because she wasn't sure that girl in the photo was ready to return. The campus was cleaner than she remembered. The benches were painted. The cafeteria had vegan options. But the library steps still creaked, and the smell of old paper still clung to the basement stacks. After the speech, an echoing, standing ovation, she didn't expect an alumni coordinator walked her to a new wall of honor outside the main hall. We updated this last year, she said. Wanted to finally catch up with our legacy makers. There, on a brushed metal plaque, Elena saw her name, her chosen name. Cassandra Ellis, Chief Justice Class of Honor Voice for the Voiceless. Beneath it, in smaller font, formerly Elena Carter, she traced the engraving with 2 fingers. Not with nostalgia, but with certainty. That girl who once studied constitutional law beside a broken radiator with no heater had made it here not because someone opened a door, but because she learned how to build her own key. A student approached her shyly clutching a notebook. "You're her?" she whispered. "I read about you." "I suppose I am," Elena said. "I want to study law too, but sometimes it feels like no one believes I can." Elena took a breath. Let them not believe, then let them watch. The girl nodded, eyes shining. "Is it true you used to be someone else?" Elena smiled. "No, I've always been me. I just stopped asking permission to be visible. After the event, another envelope found her. No name again, just her title written carefully in cursive Chief Justice. Inside was a second photo, Jason this time, in a state correctional jumpsuit, seated on a bench holding a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so sad. On the back he'd written, "I'm reading your language now. I'm still not fluent, but I'm trying. No plea, no ask for mercy, just acknowledgement." And maybe that was enough. Maybe not every apology is meant to be received as a pardon. Some are just records, admissions added quietly to a history long denied. She filed the photo beside the one of the girl with the trophy. She labelled the folder, not family, not even personal, just truth. That night, Elena returned home to her quiet DC apartment. No voices arguing over dinner, no footsteps rushing down the hall. Just a space filled with the scent of chamomile tea and the gentle scratch of her cat settling into its perch by the window. She took out the card Raya had given her so many years ago. The edges were worn, now softened from being tucked into wallets, bags, books. You are more than what they see. Keep going. She still was. She stood by the window, watching the street below, cars blinking, amber pedestrians passing like moving thoughts. Somewhere out there, her parents were still living in the same house. Her old bedroom was probably a storage room, now filled with Jason's leftover inventory. But her name, her real name, was carved into buildings they'd never step foot in. Etched into judgments that would be taught in law schools. Whispered by students who looked at her not as someone's daughter, not as someone's sister, but as someone. She didn't respond to Jason's letters, not because she hated him, but because she no longer needed anything from him. Silence, she had learned, is a verdict too, especially when chosen. And sometimes dignity sounds like folding a letter and walking away, not in bitterness, but in peace. That moment marked not an end, but the final opening act. Elena arrived at the World Justice Summit in The Hague under a different light, not as a missing sister, not as a rival to her brother's fame, but as a voice of authority carved by consequence. Her name, once whispered in family corridors, now appeared on the summit's opening brochure: Chief Justice Cassandra Ellis, Supreme Court of New York. No Carter, no connections, just accomplishment. The grand auditorium hushed as she stepped to the podium. Flags of nations lined the stage behind her, their colours muted in the soft evening light. Cameras captured her every step. There was no fanfare from her side, only gentle applause from colleagues who understood the gravity of her own quiet revolution. She paused, looking out at an ocean of faces, judges, scholars, activists, young people scribbling notes furiously. We live in an age that confuses visibility with validation, she began. That mistakes social media applause for moral authority. But authority isn't earned through likes or shares, it's built on the foundation of integrity. Her words carried weight not just because of her position, but because those who followed her journey understood the unfurling of her truth. She spoke of pedigree versus purpose, of being groomed to disappear into polite compliance, and choosing instead to write her own story, even if it meant stepping out in the dark with only her conviction for company. She closed with a line that echoed beyond international halls. They erased me from their future. So I built one they can't ignore. Applause erupted, but she listened instead to the quiet hum of minds reshaping themselves. After the talk, a line formed, young women students, colleagues each holding a card or tablet with personal stories. She shook hands, embraced a few. A law student whispered, "I'm going to law school because of you." A refugee rights lawyer said, "Your journey gives me hope, thank you." She offered only a nod and a bright smile, her voice gentle, "Let them watch." Back in her chamber, at home, the latest Time magazine arrived. The cover read, "The judge who was once forgotten," beneath a confident portrait of Cassie Ellis in her robe, gavel in hand, the American flag blurred behind her. She held the issue in her lap, the soft scent of ink mixing with her tea. There was no trace of guilt, only quiet pride, a victory lap that needed no audience. On her kitchen wall were two photos, one of herself, at 10 trophy in shaky hands, the other from her swearing in with the New York governor. She looked up at them both now and spoke out loud to the empty room. "You see, we're still here. The girl in the first photo and the woman now hailed by Time. Together, they formed a lifetime of persistence. Her phone buzzed texts from old friends, supportive messages, even a short note from Jason's attorney. "He's proud." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Responses come and go. But what she built, that remained. Later that evening, she recorded a short video message for her channel, quietly filmed without makeup or script. If your voice has been dismissed, your dreams ignored, your worth denied, build anyway. When they finally look for you, Let your name be carved in something they can't repaint. Your story matters. Share it in the comments below. You're not alone. She ended with a soft smile and a nod and tapped share. That night, she folded the Time cover and placed it next to her childhood photo. 2 milestones, 2 testaments, both earned. As the city's light shimmered outside her window, she whispered once more, "It's enough."